Thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to see all your faces back at the museum. And please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dennis Carr.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Welcome, everybody. It's a great crowd. People really turn out for Kahlo. I'm sure it's not for me. So welcome. So we are gathered together today to celebrate and learn more about the MFA's acquisition of a major work by Frida Kahlo, Dos Mujeres, or Two Women, that was painted in 1928 and is now on view in the Burke Gallery up on the third level of the Art of the Americas wing as part of the exhibition Making Modern. This is the first painting Kahlo ever sold. In 1929 to the U.S. industrialists Jackson Cole Phillips, who returned with it to the United States after what is described on the back of the painting as una noche muy agradable, or a very enjoyable evening, spent with the artist at her home, with Diego Rivera, who Kahlo would marry just the next month, Kahlo's sister, Christina, Frances Torr, and many others. It is a portrait about affirmation and identity. And it joins not only the MFA's growing collection of Latin American art, but also the museum's important collection of portraits. So the subject of the painting is two women, Salvadora y Herminia, who were domestic workers in Kahlo's parents' household, a home that we know as the Blue House, or La Casa Azul, in the Coyoacan neighborhood of Mexico City, so just a little bit south of the center of Mexico City. She had grown up with these women, a mother and a daughter, since she was a young girl, and she writes about them with fondness in her letters. It's an intimate double portrait in which she depicts them, this pair, against a scrim or screen of verdant citrus trees and butterflies, very much in the manner of a Renaissance portrait. The backdrop is probably the garden in the open central courtyard of Casa Azul, which, as Kahlo always remembered, was always filled with trees and plants and flowers, and that's how she kept it when she took over the house later in life. So on the one hand, the subject of this painting is a very natural one, two people and a setting with which she was very familiar. But it was also a radical one. To represent two indigenous women in this way stressed the diverse native heritage of Mexico and created a very ennobling portrait of two indigenous women that would have been inconceivable only a couple of decades earlier in Mexico. It's a painting I would also argue is charged with political meaning. How could it not be in the political foment of Mexico in the late 1920s when Kahlo was painting? And you're going to learn more about this today and throughout the rest of the course. So in the late 1920s, Kahlo was just developing as a painter, still experimenting and forming her own ideas about the direction her art would take. This quiet, intimate double portrait is in many ways quite different than many of her later, more sensational paintings, which have made Kahlo a household name. But we see in it, this particular painting, which the museum acquired, and it wasn't well known before the museum acquired it. It had descended directly in the family. We see her emerging interest in indigenous culture in Mexico, and specifically this word Indigenismo, or indigenism, this interest in indigenous culture that really comes to the fore in the beginning of the 20th century. And so this movement, Indigenismo, celebrated both the indigenous roots of Mexican culture and more broadly Latin American countries, but it also sought on a more political level to fully integrate indigenous communities into the nation-state of Mexico while pursuing land and educational, health, and economic and social reforms specifically engaged at indigenous groups. Indigenismo found expression in the works of a number of Mexican artists of the 20th century, like Diego Rivera, but also José Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and the Guatemalan artist Carlos Merida, who worked for much of his career in Mexico. We also see it manifest itself in the collecting of indigenous art, and especially ancient art, by these 20th century Mexican artists. as well as the building of the national museums in the state of Mexico. So these different things we're going to explore today. So while Indigenismo as a political philosophy had its roots in the late 19th century, it's really after the Mexican Revolution in the 19-teens and 20s that it becomes codified into Mexican law, specifically the 1917 Mexican Constitution, which grants quite extraordinary rights to indigenous peoples throughout the country. That was a major shift from what had come before. And it's also in this moment in the 20s that there's quite a bit of political activism going on in Mexico. And of course, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo are very much involved in this activism. Here's another image in the exhibition upstairs. This is a photograph taken of Frida Kahlo in 1939 by the photographer Nicholas Murray, who she became very close with. The photo in the gallery upstairs is in black and white, but I've chosen the color one so you can get a sense of her clothing. She's dressed as a mestiza, a mixed-race woman. In fact, her mother was mestiza, of mixed European and indigenous heritage. Her father was German. And in the late 1920s, she starts to take on a kind of more public persona of mestiza, and in some cases an indigenous woman, as many intellectuals and women did right in this time period. And jumping ahead just 3 years from the double portrait we started with, this is a very famous painting by Kahlo that was painted in 1932 while she was living in Detroit, while Diego Rivera was completing his famous mural cycle that's at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And this important painting, which is called A Self-Portrait on the Borderline Between Mexico and the United States. She juxtaposes the industrialism of America, specifically Detroit, when we see the letters Ford spelled out on the smokestacks on her left side. But on the right side is how she imagined Mexico. A Mixtec temple in the background and pre-Columbian artifacts in the foreground. And you see indigenous flora in the very foreground with the roots coming down into the earth, which mirrors the mechanical devices on the Detroit side with the power cords going down into the earth like roots. So here we have 3 images: Dos Mujeres, the photograph by Nicholas Murray, and Kahlo's self-portrait from 1932, that show 3 different ways in which Kahlo fashions herself, in some cases self-fashions herself, in relation to indigenous culture in Mexico, and by extension to this larger movement of Indigenismo, which I've talked about. So you're going to hear a lot about Frida Kahlo in the coming 9 weeks after this lecture by a number of wonderful experts about Kahlo. I am not a Kahlo expert. I'm not even a Kahlo groupie, but I have studied the pre-Hispanic and indigenous cultures throughout Latin America, specifically in Mexico. And so I want to try to set the stage for you, if I can, to give you a romp through pre-Columbian and early colonial history, to talk about the status of indigenous peoples in Mexico in the late 19th into the 20th century. And then we're going to talk specifically about Kahlo and collecting of indigenous and ancient art in Mexico, and how she figures a number of pieces within her paintings. So that's what we're going to cover today. And we're going to start with the ancient Mixtec culture. This is the culture group that Cortez discovered when he arrived in central Mexico in 1519. He had, of course, Columbus discovers America in the 1490s. Some decades later, Cortez hears of this great empire in central Mexico, and he heads west, lands in Veracruz, and then ends up marching overland and essentially conquers the Aztec or Mixtec capital. And this is an image from a 16th century codex made after the conquest period that shows the founding of this mythical city of Tenochtitlan. Supposedly, the settlement of this city was prophesized to the Mixtec, they were basically a wandering band that had come down from northern Mexico. And supposedly, according to legend, the place where they were intended to settle would be shown to them with the appearance of an eagle standing atop a cactus with a serpent in its mouth. And that's apparently what happened, because they end up settling on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico, which is in central Mexico. And this image might be familiar to all of you if you've looked at a Mexican flag recently. This is the central image on the Mexican flag, the eagle with a serpent standing atop a cactus. So when Cortez arrived, he had a very different experience than the Anglo settlers, the Puritans, had when they came to this part of the world in the 17th century, where they had discovered fairly lightly settled bands of indigenous populations. What Cortez discovered were massive cities, huge cities. Tenochtitlan probably had about 150,000 residents. It was an equal to any city in the Renaissance in the same date. This is a rendering of the Templo Mayor complex, which is the ceremonial center of Mexico City. When Cortez arrived, this is something like what he would have seen. And I chose this particular image because it was done in 1951. Our understanding of Tenochtitlan is a little bit different now, but this is closer to Kahlo's period, so this would be closer to her understanding of what that city was. So you may know, who's been to Mexico City, by a show of hands? So if you've been to Mexico City, you've undoubtedly been to the Zocalo, which is in the center or heart of the capital. And we see on the left side the Mexico City Cathedral. The presidential palace is on the right side. And under that peach-colored building that we see right in the center, just beyond that building, is actually buried the ruins of the center of Tenochtitlan. Those great pyramids that I show were basically leveled after the conquest. They were filled in, and then the colonial city of Mexico City grew up on top of it. And so they were just discovering some of these archaeological sites in the 20th century. So there were lots of major discoveries announced during Kahlo's era, and it was a really interesting time because, to suddenly realize that the city is built on actually the ruins of an ancient capital. And I show you on the screen an image of the Templo Mayor site, which is that main pyramid that I showed initially. And it was leveled right almost to the ground level. And what we see basically is a cross-section cut right through the center of the temple, but at a very low level. And you can clearly see these layers of stairs that come out. Here's a layer, here's a layer. And we've got multiple layers of pyramids that as each new Aztec ruler or Mixtec ruler came to power, they would try to expand upon the temple. And so there was all these different layers. So we're kind of seeing it like an onion, like layers of an onion cut right through the bottom. And the last layer was the largest layer, and supposedly it could be seen from the shores of the lake, which is quite a distance. So it was really an impressive structure in its day. So there had been suggestions of some of these objects already, although they hadn't yet discovered the real heart of Tenochtitlan yet in Kahlo's era. Going back to even the 18th century, they had begun to discover some of the great Mexican icons. This is what was at first thought to be a calendar stone. Now we call this the Stone of the Sun. This is a major Aztec monument. It was probably located right in that ceremonial center or complex I was talking about. And I show it here at the National Museum just to give you a sense of how large this sculpture is. So they found this in 1790 as they were digging in the streets of Mexico City. And it was a major discovery. For many years, it was stuck on the side of the Metropolitan Cathedral that I showed. And it was on view for anyone who was kind of walking past the cathedral. You'd see this giant Aztec sculpture stuck to the side of a Catholic church. Very interesting juxtaposition there. In 1790, they also discovered this fantastical sculpture. It's a gigantic sculpture. It's a sculpture of a figure called Coatlicue, which is one of the major Aztec deities. It's a pretty gruesome object when you start to look closely. Coatlicue, as myth says, was decapitated, and what you can see, she's missing a head, but there are snakes or serpents coming out of her head. So that's what's up top here. Two kind of twin serpents that are emerging from her body. And this is her torso and her arms on the side and her legs, and she's got huge talons here. She's pretty fearsome. And the word Coatlicue means she of the serpent skirt. It's pretty fashionable. So her skirt is made of serpent, literally of serpents. So you can see the intertwined serpents in her skirt, and then she has a skull, and this gets really gruesome, but hands and hearts on a necklace around her neck. The Aztec were lovely people, I'm sure, if you met them. But this is, they were really good at shock art. I mean, you came to Mexico, you came to Tenochtitlan, and you would have been shocked into submission by seeing what you saw. A lot of these sculptures were polychromed. The Spanish described them as being drenched in blood when they arrived in the 16th century. So this would have been a very impressive but also fearsome object. In the 19th century, they also discovered other archaeological finds, not just in the core of Mexico City, but throughout the countryside. And I just show on the screen, this wasn't discovered in the 19th century, it was discovered in the 20th, but one of the giant or colossal Olmec heads carved a basalt stone that's actually brought from Veracruz down into the heartland of the Olmec world, which is in Tabasco in the Veracruz region. So moving into the colonial period quickly, so we're continuing on our romp through Mexican history. So this is an image done in the colonial period, but showing the arrival of Cortez, the meeting with Moctezuma, or we know him as Montezuma, the Mixtec ruler. Things did not go well for the Mixtec and for other indigenous cultures. There were huge population declines as a result of warfare, disease, especially smallpox, just decimated the indigenous populations, enslavement, very poor treatment of on the behalf of or by the Spaniards, and it's estimated that there were about 10 million native inhabitants in the Americas at the time of Cortez's arrival, and within not that long, maybe a couple of generations, the population had declined to about 1 million. So you get from 10 million to 1 million. It's one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in world history, but it's also this incredible moment when these two major cultures, the Europeans and the indigenous populations, come together. And my show that Kristen mentioned, Made in the Americas, that was here at the MFA last year, focused on a third leg of that, is that in the same century, the 16th century, Mexico started trading directly with Asia. So you get Asian imports coming across the Pacific, landing in Mexico with Asian people on the boats, and they fuse together with, again, the indigenous and the European. So it's a really complex moment in Mexican history, and what we see is a great hybridity developing out of this. However, the Spanish weren't as interested in that. They really wanted to burn most of the heathen or objects of idolatry that they came across. In fact, there are 16th century drawings of the Spanish friars, basically in these huge, gatherings. They would gather all the idols and books and everything, and they would just burn them all. So very little survives from the pre-contact period. All the books are gone. I mean, I'm talking about the Mixtec books, but the maps are basically gone, and there's just very little that survives. So what grows out of this moment, as I mentioned, is this great hybridity. And we see, although the indigenous populations were under control of the Spanish often went to the indigenous artists to create artworks that they needed for their new churches, for example, or for domestic homes, or whatever, whether they be paintings or whether they be stone carvings. The Mixtec, as we've already learned, were incredible stone carvers. And so some of the earliest objects that survive from the post-contact period are stone carvings. And this is a very, very early object that shows the different symbols of the Passion on a cross, a very European image. But it's clearly carved by an indigenous person because they've substituted a reed here for a cornstalk. That would have been legible to an indigenous audience. So they would read maize as part of this biblical story of the Passion. We see other indigenous crafts survive. This is a featherwork shield that was probably given as one of the gifts to the Spanish when they first arrived in Mexico. It survives in a collection in Europe, and it was clearly made by a Mixtec artist with Mixtec iconography of this kind of feathered, maybe a coyote with big claws. But the whole thing, it's a shield, but the whole thing is made of feathers. And this tradition of featherworking continues in the early part of the colonial period, where the Spanish commissioned Mixtec artists who were expert featherworkers to create new images for them. But they didn't want these heathen idolatrous images. They wanted Christian images. And so we begin to see the production of incredible featherwork paintings beginning in the 16th century, made by indigenous artists, but clearly in this case copying a print source, a European print source. And this particular piece is a very, very famous one. It's in one of the very most important pieces that survives from this period. And I'm very proud to say that the MFA has just recently acquired another example, a very, very rare 16th century example of feather painting. And I show it here on the screen. The title on the bottom says St. Michael Archangelus. It's St. Michael slaying the devil, again made by indigenous artists, probably in Mexico City or Tlatelolco, the sister city. And it's made of nothing but hundreds and hundreds of pieces of tiny cut feathers, different kinds of tropical bird feathers. And here's probably one of the print sources on the right with St. Michael holding a spear. What's really cool about these objects is that they're kind of interactive. You're meant to be seen from different angles. They really come alive when light hits them in a certain way. And when you turn it just ever so slightly, this thing just explodes with color, radiant color of these different parrot and other different tropical birds. So we're getting close to the end of the colonial moment here, and I just wanted to show a very interesting object, one of my favorite objects from Mexican history. It was discovered in, I think, the 18th century as they were digging the foundations for a building. And it's essentially the base of a column of a 17th century building. But once they turned it over, they discovered an earlier Aztec carving, probably from the 16th century, underneath it. And it's really interesting that this particular image is of the earth god Tlatelolco. This is a very fearsome earth god. This is a god that you want to keep down. And Tlatelolco imagery often appears on the bottom of Aztec sculptures. So even, it was probably recarved in the 17th century. Even that late, the indigenous artists knew enough to keep Tlatelolco facing downward to the earth. And they've reused probably a larger stone tablet just for the base of this column. It's this incredible, it really sums up the early colonial period in a single object. So moving into the 19th century, Mexico starts to recognize some of this early past, but in a very kind of a haphazard way. And we see some early expositions of Mexican art, especially in Europe. This is William Bullock's exhibition called Ancient Mexico that premiered at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly in 1824. And it shows what's probably a plaster cast of the calendar stone, which we just saw here, and on the right, the Coatlicue sculpture on the right. And there's this giant weird snake here with a head coming out of it. I don't know what that is, but they weren't so concerned about accuracy here. But it's interesting, this is the exhibition from which the British Museum acquired a number of Mexican works. And it was done so with the cooperation of the Mexican government. It's kind of amazing that a government would send its works out and then they'd be acquired by a foreign government. And then Mexico, I think, wised up to this and actually tried to acquire some of the objects in the show back to Mexico. And by the mid-19th century, there was this growing collection of artifacts that were being discovered in villages and people's homes, buried under the streets of cities, and these start to be collected. So moving ahead, I wanted to talk about a major figure in the late 19th century. His name was Porfirio Diaz. He's basically a military dictator of Mexico for 8 terms. He starts his terms in 1876, and they last for 35 years until he's deposed at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution in 1911. And Porfirio Diaz had a major role in shaping the modern country of Mexico. And he was very concerned with foreign investment. He wanted to modernize Mexico, he needed foreign capital, and he basically opened up the doors of Mexico to foreign investment, especially US investment. The railroad lines started to come down. There was great US interest in mining in Mexico, for example. And this was very much to the detriment of the indigenous populations who were kind of left behind in this equation. And that's why there was a revolution in 1910. And I show very quickly an image a painting by Jose Maria Velasco, a very important Mexican artist of the 19th century, and he documents the changing landscape of Mexico. And this one I chose because of the railroad line that's coming southward into Mexico. So this is the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railroad. It goes into New Mexico, then heads south. It kind of turns left, heads south across the border into northern Mexico, and then by the 1880s, it gets down into Mexico City, and then it spreads out. And the railroad lines really opened up a lot of the Mexican countryside to development and exploration, mining exploration, economic development, but also they were discovering all kinds of artifacts right in this moment. There were local pot hunters, there were professionally trained archaeologists, different groups of people who began to do more scientifically minded excavations throughout the countryside. And on the left, I show Leopoldo Batres, who's a major figure in this moment, a Mexican archaeologist who works at Teotihuacan. And that's his discovery of a major monument from that city, which is a little bit north of Mexico City. And on the right, a fellow that I've studied a bit in my own research, William Henry Holmes, who was a curator at the Smithsonian in the late 19th century. And he's shown here digging up artifacts in the Mexican countryside with another American, Wilson Wilberforce Blake, who sets himself up in Mexico City as kind of an antiquities dealer. And he's sending a lot of Mexican antiquities outside the country. And this is right at the moment when the Smithsonian collection is forming, the Field Museum in Chicago's collection is forming, and other major US museums. And this is kind of how they're getting these artifacts, is through these kind of US connections. In fact, in this period during the Porfiriato, which is a vocabulary word on your handout, there was something called the American colony. There were something like 10,000 US citizens that were living in Mexico City during the Porfiriato period. And there were enough of them that there were actually 2 English language newspapers being published just to serve the American audience living there. We see in this moment the formation of the National Museum collection, and it's right in the late 19th century that the Aztec history of Mexico really comes to the fore. So when you think about, there were dozens and dozens of different cultural groups spanning millennia in Mexican history, but the Aztecs, or the Mixtecs, because they were located in what's now Mexico City, they become iconic in shaping this identity of what would become modern Mexico. And this is the early hall of Mixtec carvings at the National Museum before it's moved to its current location in Chapultepec, but there's our Coatlicue again here, and some other major sculptures on the right side. So the Porfiriato period, as I mentioned, was very bad for indigenous populations, most of which were living in abject poverty by 1910, and it's the reason why there was a revolution. And I show on the screen an engraving by Orozco that's in the MFA's collection. It's called The Rear Guard from 1929, and it shows indigenous people going off to war, essentially. And they were victorious, ultimately, over the Porfirian government. And then there was a period of civil war that followed that, where the different revolutionary factions were fighting against each other. It was really not until 1920 that things began to settle down, and it's the 20s that Kahlo establishes herself as an artist in Mexico. Here's another view of the same era by Diego Rivera. This is at MoMA, showing the leader Zapata, who was the revolutionary leader in Morelos. And it's kind of a much more positive depiction of Zapata. And notice the landowner here, the body of the landowner, who's been put down justly by Zapata's forces, who are carrying nothing but stakes and bows and arrows. And we see in this moment also the codification of these laws that benefited greatly indigenous populations throughout the country, or at least were attempting to benefit greatly. And this is an image called the Open Air School from 1932, also by Diego Rivera, celebrating indigenous education. We can see the farm workers in the background tilling the fields, and then women have gathered to learn in an open air environment. And interestingly, it's also in the 1920s that in Mexico, they start open air painting schools very much on the model of the European schools. And many of the Mexican modernists were actually trained in these open-air schools, like David Alfaro Siqueiros, for example, he's found his initial training in some of these early reform-minded schools that are developing in the 1920s. And it's also at this moment that interest in the ancient past of Mexico, this past that had really been suppressed for most of the history after the conquest, starts to again come to the fore, and there's a great interest in Mexican archaeology and great interest in collecting artifacts that represented the ancient cultures of Mexico. And I show on the screen the Great Pyramid of the Sun from a photograph taken by Edward Weston, who was traveling in Mexico in the 1920s. This particular image, a very famous one, dates to 1923. And it shows actually the restoration of the Pyramid of the Sun that Leopoldo Batres, the fellow I showed earlier, he had actually done. And it wasn't very successful in archaeological terms, but he had kind of changed the shape of this pyramid. But we are left with a very good sense of how gigantic this structure would have been originally. This is an almost 2,000-year-old structure. It dates to like 2nd century AD. I mean, it's really, really early. This was the major center in Mexico. And this pyramid, the Pyramid of the Sun, was the largest building in the hemisphere until the Empire State Building was created, or the tallest building. It's going to be amazing, and this was done 2,000 years ago. So Mexico rediscovers this ancient past, and it's a point of great pride for Mexicans to be the inheritors of these incredible civilizations that came before them. And again, it's right in this moment, 1920s, that Kahlo begins to depict this ancient past in her works. And this, I said before, dates to 1932, during her period in Detroit, in which she juxtaposes the industrialization of America with the rural and ancient past of Mexico. And here's I love this image, an iconic image of Frida taken in 1939, also by Nicholas Murray, like the earlier portrait I showed, in which she's standing in the courtyard of Casa Azul, the blue house. You can see the blue walls behind her and these mirrored little wall ornaments that survive in the home today. And she's holding in her hand an ancient Olmec artifact. The Olmec were even before all the civilizations we've talked about so far. They were really quite early. You know, they date back to about 3,000 years old. And she's holding an ancient Olmec object. It's a double portrait of a different kind, I guess. And we also see in this her interest in dressing like an indigenous woman. As I said before, she does have mestiza heritage, but she begins to take on this other persona of an indigenous, basically peasant woman, wearing indigenous clothing. And the clothing she chooses, most of the time, especially in this image, is from a particular region of Mexico, south in Oaxaca. Tehuantepec is the particular region where she's drawing from her mother's ancestry a bit, but she's very specific in what she's wearing, and also the use of a lot of jewelry and hair ornaments and kind of flowers in her hair. She's taking on, again, this persona of Indigenismo, both in the ancient artifact and in her contemporary dress. So she gets her interest in collecting ancient artifacts directly from Diego Rivera. I don't think she had much of an interest before she met him. After she met him, she starts to become a collector herself, and Diego Rivera had already been a collector for quite some time. He says in his own accounts that he started collecting when he was 6 years old, or at least had an interest in ancient art from the age of 6. And by 1941, just 2 years after that photograph was taken, Diego Rivera publishes a book about his ancient collection. It's called The Art in Ancient Mexico, selected and photographed from the collection of Diego Rivera, written by Gilbert Mendione and Maria Teresa Pinto. And it was published in New York, widely circulated. Thank you for Harvard. I borrowed Harvard's copy of this so I could take a photograph of the cover. And we see page after page of his collection of ancient artifacts of Mexican history. It's really, he had established, even by the early 40s, an incredibly large collection, mostly of West Mexican objects. A good 60% of the book is devoted to the art of ancient West Mexico, a very ancient culture that, again, goes back about 2,000 years. And at the time, it was thought that these ancient West Mexican cultures related to the Tarascans. So we see on the map here, it says Tarascan of Nayarit and Tarascan of Colima. These are where these sculptures I show on the screen are coming from, the western side of Mexico, these kind of earthenware figures. It was a mistake. They're actually not Tarascan at all. Tarascans were more contemporary with the Mixtec, and they were the big political rivals to the Mixtec. But the cultures that are represented here actually go back a lot further, as I mentioned, about 2,000 years. And just so you can get a little color in this presentation, I wanted to show some images of very similar ancient West Mexican objects on view in the downstairs gallery of the Art of the Americas wing. We have a very fine collection, including a group, a man and a woman on the left side, and kind of an ancestor grouping, probably. They're often shown in pairs, and the woman is raising a cup to drink. She's probably toasting. Maybe it's part of a funerary celebration on the left side, and then some pieces on the right side. And we don't know a lot about why Diego Rivera was so obsessed with ancient West Mexico, but a huge percentage of the collection comes from this particular region. I think part of it, he was really interested in the modeling of these sculptures. He talks about their fluid motion and the movement that can be depicted in the sculptures, and very interesting. But I think he was also interested because, to him, they didn't have a lot of religious content. You can't get away from religion when you look at big Aztec sculptures. But with the West Mexican objects, we see more kind of scenes of daily life. We see couples. We see musicians and dancers and acrobats, ball players, other things. And so these were kind of a little more palatable to Diego Rivera in his own mind. At the time, they didn't realize that there are quite a few religious overtones in a number of these sculptures. And I'll just point out the sculpture on the right here, this figure, is likely a shaman. She's a woman, but you can see, it's an incredible sculpture. You can see her ribs coming through her body. Amazingly molded object. She's probably a shaman figure, and she's fasting. And she's so thin from fasting that you can see her rib cage. And she's holding something in her left hand that might be peyote. We're not quite sure. But she's about to enter this hallucinogenic trance, which is part of shamanism. And so there's actually a lot going on besides just scenes of daily life in these sculptures. But anyway, so by this period and into the 1950s, Diego Rivera had collected over 59,000 ancient artifacts from Mexico. 59,000. It's incredible. And he built a whole building to house his collection, which is called the Anahuacalli, which is located just south of Coyoacan. Coyoacan is where the Blue House is. It's pretty close by. I think it's a few miles away from the Blue House, so relatively close. And he builds this gigantic structure in the he begins it in the 1940s, and they build it throughout the course of Diego Rivera's life. Here's a great image from 1951 of Rivera at his temple. And this collection is now called the Museo Anahuacalli, which houses Diego Rivera's collection. And you can go visit it today. It's a pretty impressive spot, and it's quite dramatically lit, as you can see on the right side. And not all of those 59,000 objects are authentic. There's no way that Diego Rivera could possibly have kind of looked at all. They didn't know as much as we know today. So it's more about the setting than it is about the actual artifacts. But there are some pretty remarkable objects that are part of this. So you're just kind of understanding the level at which Diego Rivera was collecting in this period. He's not just a modern artist. He's actually quite fascinated by ancient cultures. And his collection was probably one of the largest ever assembled by a private person in Mexican history. It was compared to the National Museum's collection. It's almost like half of the National Museum collection at that point. It was really an extraordinarily large collection. And Diego Rivera, as we know well, uses a lot of imagery from ancient Mexican culture in his paintings, and especially the murals. And I show on the right just one example of this. One of the murals for San Francisco that was executed in 1940, where he's showing like this being, this entity that's half industrial stamping machine and half the body of Coatlicue. You can see here the serpent skirt painted at the bottom. Here's a serpent skirt here, and then this big arm comes up, and missing a head, of course, as Coatlicue would. And here's here's Frida Kahlo down here at the very bottom. He paints lots of murals in this period. This is ones that we see in Mexico City, and he's celebrating this ancient city that was Tenochtitlan, kind of the glory of the indigenous inhabitants of Mexico. So getting back to Frida Kahlo now, and I want to focus now on a number of paintings that Kahlo did that actually incorporate ancient artifacts from Mexico, many of which were coming directly from Diego Rivera's personal collection. We see this painting again from 1932, a self-portrait on the borderline between Mexico and the United States. And I'm going to identify some of the iconography in this painting. In the back, we see what appears to be a Mixtec temple. It's a little bit vaguely painted, so we don't know exactly what it is, but some scholars have suggested that it might actually be the ancient city of Malinalco, which was a Mixtec retreat outside of Tenochtitlan. It's actually a temple site that's carved into a hillside, and there's an even more ancient site in which this thing is built, is kind of situated. So this was a place that had a lot of different layers to it already. And we can see, like, you can follow the staircases here going up the side and this kind of slanty staircase. And that's probably what we're seeing here going up the side, and then the staircase that goes diagonally this way. If you take away this central staircase with the glyphic inscriptions, then it's probably what we're seeing here. And you can see it's clearly built into a hill. It's relatively specific, so we think that this is probably her vision of Malinalco. Now, Malinalco had not been scientifically excavated just yet in 1932. It was just about to be. I think in the late 1930s they start to dig there. So we don't know, I don't know myself exactly what kind of image she would have had access to and what it looked like at this time. And then moving down through the composition, we see a West Mexico figure here in the foreground. And it's a very, very specific figure. It's a woman, and she's maybe nursing a child, but the child's head is lost. It's been cut off, or it's been damaged. And this exact image, this exact figure with this image with the head missing comes from the National Museum's collection in Mexico City. And this image was actually published in a book that Frida Kahlo would have had access to. And apparently, she brought a lot of books with her to Detroit, and she's copying directly from those books when she's painting this painting. Moving to the right, there's another kind of figure, also ancient in origin, not quite as old, but it's this figure here. And this piece is coming right out of Diego Rivera's collection, and it's actually published in this 1941 book about the art of ancient Mexico, in which his collection is featured. And it's really interesting that she chooses this particular figure. Of all the figures she could have chosen, why this figure? Why Casas Grandes? It's not actually a major part of Rivera's collection, but she chooses it for a specific purpose. The Casas Grandes culture group was located mostly in northern Mexico, but it also crossed the modern border into the United States. And so a lot of the American Southwest would have been part of this larger Casas Grandes culture group. So showing that the modern fixed borders don't have any relation to the ancient borders that existed throughout the hemisphere for millennia. And I think she's making a statement here of these ancient cultures that actually crossed the border between what's now Mexico and the United States. Here's another Frida Kahlo painting, which shows a pre-Columbian sculpture in it. This is a very interesting object. It just came on the market in 2010. It was not widely known before that. It had descended directly in the family of the original purchaser, who was Walter Batch, who was an art critic and curator who was very, very close with Diego Rivera. And in 1938, Frida Kahlo gets her own exhibition at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York City. And this is the first painting that's sold out of this gallery show. I forget the story exactly, but it was supposed to be Diego Rivera's show, and he falls behind in his production. He can't meet the date for the show in New York. So Frida Kahlo writes this nice letter to the gallery owner, Julian Levy, and says, I'm sorry, Diego Rivera can't do it, and so forth. And then she gets invited to do it in his place. So she quickly gathers together a group of objects and goes to New York, and then eventually goes on to Paris. And this particular work is fascinating. It's very small. It's about 6.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And it's surrounded by a tin hand-worked frame from Oaxaca. It's a very traditional frame. You'll see these kinds of frames in many of the markets, especially in Oaxaca, but really throughout Mexico. And it kind of strikes me as something that you might consider to be an ex voto painting. An ex voto painting was this type of painting that's very popular in Mexico, especially in the 19th century, but that kind of painting tradition certainly dates back earlier. And they're paintings which depict an event in someone's life in which maybe they were miraculously saved, or maybe they healed from an illness or something like that, and there was some kind of divine intervention in their lives. And these ex voto paintings are meant to commemorate and then to give thanks for this particular event. And so she chooses this kind of format, a very, very small format, for this incredible little oil painting. And so what we see in it is actually another West Mexican sculpture from Colima, from Diego Rivera's personal collection. And you can see the body position and the way the head is turned. I mean, it's clearly this figure. Usually, these kinds of figures are holding something, like a club or a spear or something like that. And this figure might have been holding something originally, but that has been lost. It's hard to know. Diego Rivera called this particular sculpture a warrior ball player. A warrior ball player. And there's something called the ball game in Mesoamerica that's very popular. They actually played it here in in what's now the United States. There's some evidence that there were actually ball courts going pretty far north. It was a ritual game that was played by two teams of players within a ball court. They had a big rubber ball that they knocked around. They had to keep the ball aloft as it bounced from one side of the court to the other. And there are lots of West Mexican figures showing ball players dressed in the ball player garb. And this one's not specific enough to know exactly what it is. But anyway, that's what Diego Rivera thought it was. So this particular painting sold in 1938, and there was an article in the New Yorker published on the occasion of this exhibition. And we don't know who wrote the article, but the person describes this painting as consisting of, quote, a Mexican idol looking lonely on a large field. This symbolizes the survival of Mexico in a shaky world. And that's a very good reading of this particular work. We presume that this author would have gotten this directly from Kahlo. We don't know for sure, but it's certainly a very straightforward reading. Other later scholars have read more autobiographical things into this. Could this actually be a self-portrait of Kahlo in a weird kind of way? She was going, in fact, through a very difficult period in her own life with Diego Rivera, with her suicide attempts, and there were a lot of things going on in Frida Kahlo's life in the 1930s. So, could this really be about her? Hard to know. Other works, there was a second work painted the same year, 1938, that also includes pre-Columbian art. This is a painting that originally was called "The Square is Theirs," but now is often referred to as Four Inhabitants of Mexico. And the four inhabitants, actually there are five, I don't know why they say four, but there is a small girl here who is Frida Kahlo. It's a self-portrait. She's supposed, about 3 years old or something, and she's staring up at a pregnant woman, West Mexican figure that's turned at a kind of 3/4 angle. And again, this very same sculpture appears in the publication Art in Ancient Mexico, figure 60, of this particular pregnant woman. So Frida Kahlo is looking up at this pregnant woman. There's probably a papier-mâché skeleton on one side. There is a fellow on horseback that's made of reeds, like reeds. Again, this is the kind of thing that you'd find in a market in Mexico. And on the figure on the left side is a man wearing overalls, but he's wired. He's actually like a kind of a doll that's been wired with firecrackers and other things that they would set off right before Easter. And again, kind of something you'd see in the market. So these are the four inhabitants, really five, of Mexico. And 2 years later, she kind of revisits this theme in a larger scale work that's called The Wounded Table, which shows Frida Kahlo, now an adult, mingling with this same kind of menagerie of figures, the skeleton, the Judas figure is there too, her niece and nephew are there at the table. It's kind of a gruesome painting in some ways, like the table itself is coming apart and there's blood coming out of the table, the kind of cracks in the table here and here. the table legs are not really table legs, but actually human legs, and the skin has been torn away from the legs to reveal the muscle and the bone that's supporting this tabletop in which they're surrounded. It's a very, very unusual painting. I'll let another scholar go into it in more detail. Thank you. But this does, she gets some renown from this painting. There's a photograph on the left side from 1942 of her at the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, where she had a number of exhibitions, and she's surrounded by some Mexican luminaries. And you can see she's wearing, again, the very traditional Mexican clothing. And then a very strange image of her kind of fake painting this painting on the lower right side, where she's really, really dressed up with a lot of makeup, but she's kind of like supposedly painting this painting. And it's clearly a staged image and has, they would have figured out all the details and exactly what she's wearing and what kind of meanings might be associated with those kinds of clothes. This is this very traditional clothing from Tehuantepec, from Oaxaca, especially the bodice of it, the huipil, which is the upper part of the clothing. And that's pretty easy to read, but there's something else going on in this image that I noticed when I came across this photograph, is that she's sitting on a reed mat, which, that's not a very, most people would overlook that kind of imagery, but for an indigenous person, a reed mat was really quite significant. It was the symbol of authority in the indigenous ancient cultures of Mexico. And the governors of Mexico City and the Tlatoani, the imperial rulers of the Mixtec Empire, they wouldn't sit on chairs. They would sit on woven mats and back stools. They're called, actually, I had to write this word down. It's Tepoztli, which is the name for, the Nahuatl name, the indigenous name for this kind of woven mat that would have been a symbol of power in ancient Mexico. And I think she might have just slipped one of those into this image. There's many weird things about this particular work, but there's one strange aspect to it. And you can see, here's Frida Kahlo in the center, and then her right arm comes down and stops, and then there's like this prosthesis, and then it connects to the arm of the pre-Columbian figure. It's a really weird image, and this like impossibly long arm stretching out to embrace or to become really unified or one with Frida Kahlo herself. And but when you again go back to the artifacts, the same thing appears in a work that was owned by Diego Rivera and is published as Figure 52 in the Art of Ancient Mexico, where it's this what's called a couple in loving attitude, a man and a woman. Woman is on our left, man is on the right, and the woman is reaching out to give her husband a drink from a cup. You can kind of make that out here. This is the cup, and she's kind of turning it to give him a drink. It's a very sensitive sculpture, very typical of this period. And also, when you think of other very famous paintings of this, roughly the same period, there might be some relationship between the famous work on the left, the two Fridas, and these ancient Nayarit sculptures that are 2,000 years old. So Diego Rivera said of Frida Kahlo that she belonged to a group of painters who can definitely be called Mexicans because they are embedded magnificently in the tradition that comes from the remote and extraordinary Tarascans of Colima and Nayarit. He was really fixated on Colima and Nayarit and this idea that there were Tarascans. He's kind of, Diego Rivera is from roughly the same area, so I think maybe it's just part of his own persona was trying to establish this ancient history of the particular part of Mexico which he's from. But he clearly links Frida Kahlo directly with this kind of thinking in 1942. And there's just a couple other works I want to show you quickly. This is another self-portrait from 1945, and it shows she's continuing to engage in the mid-1940s with this idea of using Mexican sculpture. And again, by no surprise, the exact work is part of Diego Rivera's collection and is at Anahuacalli, this museum that Diego Rivera founded. But it wasn't published with this particular pose in the period. This is a pose that she chose herself. So in many of the other cases, we see her copying directly from the books, and she's really interested in archaeological authenticity and really exact reproduction, to the point where she, if there's a crack in the neck or the leg, she'll put it in the work because she's really trying to replicate. And again, some scholars have read autobiographical details into these broken, these sculptures that have kind of broken bodies. Frida had a broken body. And then the last work I'm going to show is from 1951, a still life that incorporates a work not from Diego Rivera's collection, but from Frida Kahlo's own personal collection. A small dog, a Mexican hairless dog, a very classic kind of indigenous dog that you see in a lot of the ancient sculptures of both West Mexico, but also the Mixtec and other parts of Mexico. And this was painted in 1951 for her dentist, Samuel Fastlich. And she says it was painted with great love, great care for him. And she dates it 1951 and signs Coyoacan, where she's painting, where the studio is. And so here's Frida Kahlo in her studio in 1943. And she's surrounded, there's the two Fridas on the up here, which is work we just saw. And then behind her, she's surrounded by all these incredible artifacts. And most of them are from ancient West Mexico. The whole top shelf is ancient West Mexican. This is a little, I think, a Nayarit house here, a little house model that's in a glass case, and then some other figures down here. I'll quickly go through some images of her garden, in which there were ancient sculptures that were brought out into the garden, and they're still there. You can see them. And here's a 1951 image of the interior of the house, what's called pre-Cortesian figures, these ancient figures that really look like they're in a display case. They were real collectors. Here's another image with antiquities and a fireplace, and the fireplace itself is actually shaped like an Aztec temple or a Mixtec temple with all these angles that are coming out and coming back in as the pyramid goes upward. And for those of you who've actually been to the Blue House, you'll know that there's actually a Mixtec temple right in the garden of the Blue House. It was created by Diego Rivera and Frida in the 1940s after they were married and living together at Casa Azul, and he actually created a model of this temple in which they used to display their pre-Columbian collection. And so there's still some figures here. This is a photograph from 2014, but you can see some of the pre-Columbian figures. And this pyramid was actually recreated in the most recent show about Frida that was at the New York Botanical Garden, I think. They recreated this inside one of the greenhouses. But it's quite iconic, and it also tells you a lot about the level of their collecting. And so, just to wrap up with Frida, I wanted to show this image from 1942. The painting was originally called The Girl, the Moon, and the Sun, and it was painted, it's a portrait of a girl that Frida Kahlo knew. She was the daughter of one of the domestic workers in the household. She would have known her quite well. And she was supposedly from Teotihuacan. Her family was from that region of Mexico, just north of Mexico City. I was showing the Pyramid of the Sun image earlier. And what we probably see in the background is the Pyramid of the Sun on the right, the really gigantic temple, and the Pyramid of the Moon, which is adjacent to it at the site on the left side. And above the one on the right is a sun, and above on the one on the left is a moon. And she's placing this indigenous figure in this landscape. She's wearing indigenous but modern clothing. She's not meant to look like an ancient person or someone that, this is not supposed to be a historic image. It's supposed to be a modern image of a girl from 1942. And so she's wearing a sweater that she might have gotten from one of the markets locally, and she's holding an airplane model in her hand. So we've been looking at a lot of self-portraits, but I wanted to kind of wrap up with a real portrait, kind of like the double portrait that we started with. That's from 1928. So, by way of a conclusion, I wanted to just open up the story a little bit and talk about other Mexican artists that were also working in the same mode. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo they weren't the only Mexican modernist artists who were very much engaged in the pre-Columbian past. There was Miguel Covarrubias, for example. There's a self-portrait of Miguel Covarrubias on the right with his face in the guise of an Olmec figure, what's called a weir jaguar. Don't get me started on what that is exactly, but he has the lips of an Olmec figure, and then an actual Olmec figure that is at the Worcester Art Museum, very close to us, that was acquired in 1958 directly from Covarrubias's collection. After his death in 1957, his widow, Rosa, sold off his collection of ancient artifacts, so a lot of them hit the market. And so the Worcester Art Museum, the very next year, acquired this particular work, a really early Olmec figure. It's 800 BC. I mean, it's almost 3,000 years old. And Covarrubias was actually a trained archaeologist. He was a man of many talents. He worked in the United States for quite a while, but he was a field-trained archaeologist, and he had developed all of these ideas about ancient cultures in Mexico. And there's one very famous image that he created in 1946 of the evolution of the Mask of the Rain God, where he started with the Ur culture, the earliest culture, the Olmec culture, in this kind of image of the weir jaguar here with those lips that come down. And then how that stylistic influence descends through all the later culture groups. And what's amazing is that he wasn't that far off. Despite many years of digging in Mexico and careful iconographic analysis, he was onto something, whereas a lot of his contemporaries were completely off base in what they were thinking about some of these ancient cultures. At the MFA, we actually have an object that was owned by Miguel Covarrubias, another Olmec artifact that's on view in the Art of the Americas wing. I encourage you to go see it. It's not 10 feet across. It's actually quite small. It's a fish effigy pectoral bead that is quite early. It was acquired in 1988 by the MFA, but it clearly came out of his Covarrubias's personal collection. Other very famous artists like David Alfaro Siqueiros was working in this mode as well, and he's the subject of an entirely other lecture. But I love this particular work. This is also in the MFA's collection from 1931, and you see this colossal head of this man named Moises Sáenz, who was one of the major educational reformers in Mexico right in this period, in the 20s and in the 30s. And he was implementing a very pro-indigenous policy of educational reform throughout Mexican schools. And he created secondary schools in Mexico, which is a major thing, and he also led this kind of a revolution in education, trying to get education to the indigenous communities across the countryside, which was incredibly important. Most of these communities are living in abject poverty, and he's trying to reach out with educational initiatives. And so he was, a very strong proponent of Indigenismo. And when Siqueiros creates this image of him, I think he does it in the guise of one of these colossal Olmec heads. I mean, what else could that be? So I'll leave it at that. And then my very last group of images, there was also interest in Indigenismo that came from the outside of Mexico. They weren't all Mexican modernists who were involved in this. And there was one American, a trained architect by the name of William Spratling, who came to Mexico right in this moment. He was friends with Frida Kahlo. You can see a portrait of them together on the right side. And William Spratling, he came to Mexico and he was kind of looking for work. And the American ambassador, Dwight Morrow, sent him to Tasco, which is a city, it was one of the early colonial cities in Mexico, and it was the site for centuries of the great silver mines. It was a huge silver production center for a long, long time during the colonial period. But by the 20th century, it had really fallen on hard times. And Morrow sends Spratling, this kind of eager young fellow, to Tasco, and he sets himself up as a silversmith, interestingly. And he creates a little workshop with, he had probably one silversmith working for him in a small workshop, and this workshop grows over time, and eventually he starts influencing other artists, and Tasco becomes known as a major center of silver production today. And you can go to Tasco today and buy fantastic silver objects. And Frida Kahlo was a great lover of Tasco silver, and we see a portrait of her on the left wearing a beautiful silver necklace made by Frederick Davis, who was another American who ended up down in this area. And the MFA, we have a great silver collection from the pre-Hispanic period to the colonial period into the 20th century. We don't have a lot of Mexican silver, and so we've recently been trying to acquire new pieces of Mexican silver. And William Spratling and the other Tosco artisans have they tell a very interesting story of this moment and its relationship with Indigenismo in Mexico. And I'll just say we've recently acquired two very nice objects. On the lower right is a jaguar brooch made by Spratling. The image of it really comes out of the early 16th century Mexican codices showing images of animals. And it really has a strong kind of pre-Columbian bent to it. And above it is an interesting object that was given to us by a collector in California. It's a portrait head of Dolores Del Rio, who was a very famous actress. She was like the first Latina crossover actress. I mean, she made her reputation in Hollywood in the 1920s and 30s, and then returned to Mexico and became a huge star in the 40s and 50s. And so in the 50s, the mid-50s, there's a commission for Spratling to make a portrait head of Dolores Del Rio, and the designer of this was Miguel Covarrubias. And he chooses a very indigenous looking, very kind of pre-Columbian looking mask, almost like a mask from Teotihuacan, to show Dolores Del Rio, who didn't look quite like this. So it's kind of a fascinating blending of a modern actress with this ancient past of Mexico. So those two objects came in the collection just within the past year, which is very exciting. And then today, it's 2:15, probably right now, this piece is being presented to the Board of Trustees of the MFA for acquisition. We're very, very excited about it. It is a mid-century object made by Spratling, and in this case, he's actually incorporating beads from some kind of Maya archaeological site. These beads were traded widely throughout Mexico, and in this and a group of other pieces, he actually incorporates these ancient objects into a necklace that would have been worn. So again, tells this incredible story, and for us it's important because it links our important Maya and pre-Columbian collections with artisanal practices in the 20th century. So I will leave it at that. I want to say thank you for coming, and I'm happy to take questions, and I hope this sets the stage for what will come later in this course. Thank you very much. Thank you. So they're coming around with microphones if anyone has any questions. Just be sure to speak into the mic. There's a question. Oh, she's on her way already.
Thank you very much. I'm curious that you didn't, in your brief introduction of her at the beginning, you didn't mention anything about the feminist connection of Frida and the...
It's very, very strong. Of course, I was hoping to leave that for other speakers. I didn't want to talk about every aspect of Frida Kahlo, and there are many. I really wanted to focus on the ancient connections with her, but what I think is interesting about the ancient sculptures of Mesoamerica is that they could also be read as feminist objects in a way. I mean, Coatlicue is a woman. She's one of the most powerful deities. That's really a very impressive sculpture from the Aztec world. A lot of the West Mexican figures are actually women. And this was, in some cases, these were, in some cases, matriarchal societies. And especially this area of Tehuantepec down in southern Mexico where she's dressing, she's clearly taking on the clothing of indigenous women. This was also a matriarchal society that had survived well into the 20th century. So it's a little bit beyond my own expertise, and I hope that some of the scholars later in the course will address this more specifically. But thank you.
Hello, thank you. It was a lovely lecture.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could elaborate a little on the use of Mixtec and the use of Aztec. At one point, it seemed to me you were almost using them interchangeably.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. In popular culture, we know this group as the Aztecs. Even more recently, there have been huge exhibitions about the Aztecs. That name is a bit of a misnomer, and it's more appropriate to call them Mixtec, which is part of this larger culture group that ends up settling in central Mexico. And the Mixtecs create this gigantic empire that by the time Cortez arrives really stretched from central Mexico all the way down into southern Mexico, really a vast empire they created. So I slipped between the two terms because a lot of people don't know Mixtec, they know Aztec, but in fact Mixtec is the better term. So from here on out, as you use that term, use Mixtec. Yeah.
This is super specific about that dos mujeres, but
Yep.
we're used to, I think, like in Western culture where the daughter would have been kind of cheated over to the right a little. Was that, and then the mother, so they're kind of mushed to the left. Is that because, why was that? Was it inexperience? Was it she added the mother? Why was it framed that way, do you think?
I don't know the answer to that. Elliot Davis is speaking next week about this painting, and maybe she can think about it for the next week and give you a good answer. Also, you have to come back for next week to get the answer. We do know that it was based, generally speaking, on Renaissance prototypes in which she was studying from her own reading and her own access to books in the 20s. And we do know, just from looking at the painting physically, that there have been some alterations between the two faces. There is this part right above the cheek of one of the face, the face that was clearly changed and possibly changed by Kahlo herself. So there was some editing going on in the center. We don't fully understand it just yet. And the other thing that's happened with that painting physically is that the mother's apron has been removed. So she was kind of first shown like a domestic servant wearing an apron. And at some point, Kahlo changed her mind and erased that and basically put them in, I would say, kind of like street clothes. I mean, they dress like a very normal indigenous person, but not overtly indigenous in their aspect of the dress. So Kahlo's playing around with the composition a little bit. It's really pretty early in her work, and we'll have to think a little more on the specific question you had about the relationship of the two figures so close together.
There's first the two women, and then later a painting by Diego Rivera that they look somewhat similar. So to what degree was Frida either copying his work or influenced by his work?
I think Frida Kahlo is clearly, especially in the early years, heavily influenced by Diego Rivera's work. There's no question about it. Not only his work, but also his particular interests in representing indigenous culture, for example, in collecting pre-Columbian art, in choosing specific subject matter to represent. That begins to change over the course of time. Over the course of her career, she goes in different directions, and those directions are going to be explored throughout the remainder of the course. But she's quite young compared to, there was quite a bit of age difference between the two. She's a young student when they first meet, and he's a very established, very, very famous painter, so you couldn't help but be within his orbit and his very strong artistic influence. You can see that from the way he describes Frida Kahlo as a painter who responds to the indigenous culture. I mean, it's very much in the way that Diego Rivera himself is thinking. And I think in the early, the painting, it's very different than most of Frida's later paintings. It's, as I kind of called it, a quiet, intimate portrait without a lot of bombast or other kind of more surrealist elements that you see very clearly in her later work. So it's a really interesting kind of formative painting that occurs so early in her career that she's still exploring her own identity as an artist. Yep. Up front.
Could you say a little bit more about the way that the collectors like Diego Rivera were accumulating these pre-Columbian objects? Was there a market? Were people digging them up out of the ground and bringing them to his door? I mean, how was that being done?
That's a very good question. So from Diego Rivera's own words, what he says is that he was collecting from the time he was a young boy. He says 6 years old specifically. And he says that he was collecting works that would be brought into the cities from neighboring villages. So these would be, pieces that were uncovered, of farmers hoeing the field, and they uncovered these artifacts, which are really not that far below the ground. And this happens all over Mexico, beginning with the railroads that come in and kind of dig up the ground, but also, just in the course of daily life, people are always finding pre-Columbian artifacts. And there's a name for this. It's called huaquero, which means, kind of someone who's, these fellows who go in and try to find these objects and dig kind of illegally and kind of under the radar. They're digging for these artifacts. And these huaqueros would come into the towns and they would sell these artifacts. And quickly, Mexico realized that this is not a great practice, so they've tried to pass laws to regulate it, but there's no way to regulate it because this is privately owned land, and people are always finding stuff all the time. And we don't know exactly the mechanism for Diego Rivera actually collecting. I think he probably did a lot of it personally, but if you collect 59,000 objects, there's no way you can be on top of all that. I bet he was buying everything he saw, and he was buying big collections that had already been formed. That's the only way you could accumulate so many different objects. And he couldn't have scrutinized each one. This practice of the huaqueros still very much goes on today. Yep. Can you spell that word? Huaquero? Now you're going to get me. I think it's Huquero. Is that AR? Yeah, handout for next week. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Good,
Thank
thank
you
you for
everybody
coming.
for coming today.